everyone, Midits here. A while back, I talked about the first film in the Wimpy Kid trilogy, 2010's Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Today we'll be moving on to the sequel, 2011's Roderick Rules. Now, I love this film, so let's get right into talking about it. First, let's talk about some characters who are introduced in this film. There are only really two major characters to talk about though. The first new addition is Holly Hills, played by Peyton List. She's a new girl at Greg's school, and Greg is constantly trying to get her attention during the events of the movie. Then there's Bill, portrayed by Fran Kranz. He's a new member of Loaded Diaper, and throughout the movie we see that Frank sees him as a bad influence, as Bill's a grown adult and he's still living with his parents. And there is one thing I believe that I forgot I mentioned in the first movie, and that was the director. Tor Frudenthal directed the first movie, but now Roderick Rules and the next movie are directed by someone else, that being David Bowers. Anyway, that's all the important new information, so let's move on to the film. The movie begins a little bit before Greg's first day of 7th grade. His school is holding an event where everyone is going to a roller rink. Roderick convinces Greg to try and go skate with Holly, but this just ends up being a way for Roderick to embarrass Greg. A bunch of teens start causing a huge mess on the rink, and then Susan uses a speakerphone to talk to Greg, and then has Frank carry Greg out of the roller rink. And this just goes to once again show that Greg and Roderick clearly do not have the best relationship. Later on, Susan creates an idea where if Roderick and Greg spend time together, they can get a currency called Mom Bucks. They can then give Susan the Mom Bucks in exchange for real money. This causes Roderick to want to spend time with Greg, except he obviously only wants to do it for the money. And now while at home, Greg, Roderick, and Rowley see an advertisement for a local talent show. Riley wants to do a magic act with Greg, which Greg detests doing. Meanwhile, Roderick considers this as a big chance for his band to go big by winning the competition. One small storyline we see is that Greg and Rowley are trying to make a viral YouTube video, but this ends up going poorly. And now, later on in the film, the Heffleys go to church one day, and Greg realizes there is a stain on his pants from a chocolate bar he accidentally sat on. Greg goes into church wearing Susan's sweater to cover it up, but then Roderick causes the sweater to fall. And now everyone at church is shocked by what they think is a poop stain on Greg's pants. And then Greg realizes it's Roderick's fault, so they get into a massive fight at church. Susan and Frank go on a trip with Manny, and they decide to leave the two of them at home so that they can spend time together. And they also tell Greg and Roderick that they cannot have anyone come over during the time they're gone. So of course, Roderick immediately goes and tells everyone he knows that he's having a huge party later that night at his house. Roderick makes Greg think that he's going to be a part of the party, but Roderick locks him in the basement. Greg calls Rowley and tries to get his help, but Roderick leaves Rowley in the basement too. But when Susan calls Roderick, Greg is able to get Roderick to let him out of the basement. This leads to Greg and Rowley being able to spend the night at Roderick's party, and the next day, the house is a complete mess. Not only that, but Susan called them saying that Manny was sick, so they're going to be returning home early. This leads to the two of them rushing to clean the entire house. They are able to do this, but there is one major thing they have to do. The door to their bathroom has something written on it in marker. So Greg and Roderick get a replacement from the basement, but then Greg has a really bad realization. That being, the original door had a lock and the new one doesn't. Later on, Susan interrogates the two of them, and while Roderick says nothing, Greg spills what happened, but he downplays it. Greg says that it was just a band rehearsal and that they got to bond over the weekend, which would be ruined if Roderick learned that Greg told on him. So Susan believes Greg and does not punish the two of them. The thing is though, Greg and Roderick actually do become friends after this, but that doesn't really last super long though, as one day Frank and Susan accidentally find photos that were taken during the party. Both Greg and Roderick get into deep trouble, and Roderick is now not allowed to perform at the talent show. And since Roderick learned that Greg told Susan, the relationship between Greg and Roderick is even worse than before. There's another point where Susan and Frank have to leave from home, but they don't want to leave Greg and Roderick home alone, so they leave the two of them at Leisure Towers, where their grandpa lives. While there, Greg finds out that Holly is also at Leisure Towers, and Greg gets the chance to have a proper conversation with her. Things are beginning to look good for Greg, but then Roderick grabs hold of Greg's journal while he's asleep. Roderick plans on taking the journal to Holly, so Greg begins chasing Roderick while still in his underwear. Greg takes the journal back and goes to a bathroom so they can start getting rid of pages from the journal. But then Greg realizes that he's in the woman's restroom. Greg is noticed in there, but he's able to get out. And if things couldn't get worse for Greg, it turns out that Roderick recorded Greg running in and out of the bathroom and had it on tape. So now Greg has to constantly deal with the looming threat of Roderick potentially telling people about the incident at Leisure Towers. The day of the talent show arrives, and even though Roderick can't perform, Susan still says he has to go. Throughout the film, Rowley has been mentioned as having an assistant for his magic act who's an 8-year-old, but before the talent show begins, Scotty gets stage fright and is unable to perform the act. Also, it turns out that Bill decided Loaded Diaper was going to perform without Roderick. Greg feels really guilty about this, so he makes a decision. He tells Susan that if she allows Roderick to play with his band, he will do the magic show with Rowley. Susan sees that Greg really cares about his brother to the point that Greg is willing to embarrass himself in front of a giant audience just so that Roger can perform. So Susan agrees to this. Riley and Greg do their performance, and while it was meant to be a magic act, it ended up accidentally turning into a comedy skit that everyone in the audience loved, including Holly. Loaded Diaper then performs, and during the performance, Roderick tells Bill he's out of the band. And now people aren't really impressed by Loaded Diaper, but people get into the performance when Susan starts dancing on stage, and everyone dances along with her. Later, Roderick, who now knows that Greg is the reason he was able to perform, gives Greg the tape from Leisure Towers. And now by the end of the movie, you can confidently say that the two of them are friends. Well, there is one last thing. Greg uploads a video of the whole dancing mom thing from the talent show, which becomes a huge hit. And Roderick is not very happy about it. And that's how the movie ends. I just feel like there's so much to talk about when it comes to this movie. This film is perfect when it comes to building off the foundation that the first movie made. Roderick Rules is my favorite Wimpy Kid movie, and it might even be my favorite piece of Wimpy Kid media ever. It is less accurate to the original book compared to how the first movie was, but I believe that the changes made in this movie are great as they help to develop ideas in the book which we never got to see. I just want to talk about the characters and how incredible the cast is. Greg and Rowley are both just as great in this movie, even if Rowley doesn't have as much focus in this film compared to the first one. With Greg, there is a change from the original books that I honestly appreciate was made in the film. Greg does seem like a better friend to Rowley after the events of the first movie, especially compared to the Roderick Rules book, where their relationship stayed exactly the same. And it makes this version of Greg interesting since he isn't an exact one-to-one adaptation of Greg from the books. And that's really cool because we get to see how this change in personality will affect how events go in the movies compared to the books. And now, Devin Bostick as Roderick Heffley is one of the greatest casting decisions in the history of cinema. There is no hyperbole or exaggeration. It's not even opinion. That's a flat out fact. Roderick stole every scene he was in when it came to the first movie, and it is incredible that we get to see more of him here. The chemistry between him and Zachary Gordon gets to shine in this movie, and the aspects of Roderick's character that made him so great in the books are translated perfectly here. He constantly messes around with Greg, and it's always entertaining to watch. Also, the scene where Roderick is told that he can't perform at the talent show is easily one of the best acted scenes in the trilogy. You can really just feel the emotion he has in that scene. Frank gets a bit more screen time here, and Steve Zahn gets the chance to make Frank a lot more interesting. In the books, while I do like Frank's character, he does sort of fill the role of a stereotypical dad. In this film, though, we see Zahn turn Frank into an absolute nut job. There are multiple scenes during the movie, such as the scene where Frank and Susan return from their trip, where Frank seems extremely close to just completely losing it, and every time it happens, it's absolutely hilarious. And now, while he isn't that major of a character except for one side storyline in the movie, I want to highlight Karan Brar as Chirag. I love the rivalry he and Greg have over the attention of Holly, and it's really funny because the entire time they're doing this, neither of them actually tried talking to her. And also, the adaptation of the Invisible Chirag joke from the book is amazing. And once again, I just want to reiterate how every member of the cast is so great. I could probably go on and on about how each actor is great at their role, but we should probably move on at this point. While I did like the rougher and more homemade look of the first movie, I also really like how the animated scenes look in this film. In this movie and the next one, it looks like the books came to life. It is a perfect one-to-one translation of the art style of the books. Also, I feel that the pacing in this film is better than the first, but once again, that's an issue I kind of had with the first Wimpy Kid book itself. There are tons of great scenes in this film. Just a couple of my personal favorites are when Greg and Roderick had to clean up after the party, the talent show scenes where some of the side characters get their time to shine, the moment Roderick steals Greg's journal, the intro, the church fight scene, the tinfoil ball incident. There are so many great moments from this movie that I simply cannot talk about them all. This is my favorite piece of Wimpy Kid media. I personally do believe that this movie is better than the book, as the actors add so much to the characters. And it does feel like there's a lot more character development by the end of the movie compared to the book. That is once again because the movies decided to take a different route compared to the books, and I'm honestly really excited to talk about the next movie, as we're going to see a lot of major changes to the story that make it really intriguing. This is an absolutely perfect sequel. It took everything that made the original great, added more of it, and took out any not so great features to make the definitive Wimpy Kid story. Anyway, that's gonna be it for now. I truly am having so much fun getting to talk about these movies again. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.